As the NHL regular season winds down, the hunt for the playoffs begins to ramp up, followed by the most exciting time in sports, the Stanley Cup playoffs. 16 teams will go into the gauntlet, with one trying to emerge to hoist Lord Stanley's Cup, but this time of year means something else as well. For 16 other teams, their dreams die prematurely as they fail to even make the playoffs. And so as these teams begin to be eliminated from playoff contention, GMs, coaches, players, and fans will begin to look back on the season that was and wonder, what could have been? The Chicago Blackhawks are one of those teams, the first eliminated from playoff contention. What is it that doomed the 2023-24 squad? Let's take a look. When a season goes down the tubes, the finger pointing begins, and it always starts with the head coach. Coaches on bad teams are lucky to make it through the season, but once it ends, questions really start to intensify. Such is the case for second-year head coach Luke Richardson, who seems poised to lead the Chicago Blackhawks to an even worse record in his second year as head coach than he did in his first. The team's 50-point pace would put the 23-24 Blackhawks as not only one of the worst teams in the modern NHL, but one of the worst Blackhawks team in a half-century. This is clearly a rebuilding team without a lot of talent that suffered some major injuries throughout the season. But should this failing be laid at the feet of Luke Richardson? In all honesty, a large part of it probably should be. When looking at the factors a coach can control, a lot of them don't weigh favorably on Richardson. The Blackhawks are one of the worst teams in the NHL when it comes to overcoming deficits, and they're one of the worst teams when it comes to holding on to a lead, which indicates that Richardson and his coaching staff are doing a bad job adjusting their game plans. They're also one of the worst teams in the NHL when it comes to goal differential in the first period, meaning Richardson's Blackhawks are not prepared for their competition. And his line deployments are very questionable, especially that Kurashev-Foligno-Bedard line that's gotten the lion's share of the minutes, despite being one of the worst possession lines on his team. Like I said, it's not entirely his fault because you can only work with the players that you have, but as a coach of a bad team, sometimes it's your job to make chicken salad out of chicken shit, and all Richardson seems to have done this year is turn chicken shit into chicken diarrhea. I think he probably manages to survive a firing because of all the factors going against him, but in my opinion, if I was the Blackhawks, I'd go ahead and cut bait with Richardson right now. It'll be a lot easier to find a good coach for Bedard in the offseason than it will during the middle of next season.
Listen up, Fives. A 10 is speaking.
Speaking of the young superstar Connor Bedard, how much culpability does he hold for this whole mess? Bedard entered the season with a ton of hype around him, being labeled as a generational talent. And when you compare him to past generational talents like Alex Ovechkin, Sidney Crosby, and Connor McDavid, that label is not one that's going to be easy for anybody to live up to. For Bedard, though, I would say he has met expectations, not exceeded them, but he's been as good as advertised. He's been almost a point-a-game player in his 50-plus games so far on the year. He missed a good chunk of time due to multiple injuries. He's also had to deal with just a general dearth of talent around him. So every time he steps on the ice, Bedard's had to be the Blackhawks' best player, and he has lived up to that billing. Of course, we're all going to be wondering what could have been if Bedard had managed to play a full 82 games, but alas, we'll never know. The fact is, in the time that he has been on the ice, he has been every bit the generational talent that he was billed to be. Now, has he reached the echelons of Ovechkin and Crosby, who were both 100-point players in their first year? No. But McDavid was barely a point-a-game player, and he missed a good amount of time due to injury in his rookie year as well. Austin Matthews was only a 70-point player in his first campaign. So yeah, Chicago fans, don't worry, it's looking very unlikely that Bedard's going to turn into a Yakupov-type bust, and this bad year is certainly not an indictment on him or his talent. A lot of teams can have their seasons done in by bad goaltending, but for the Chicago Blackhawks, that oddly hasn't been the case. Peter Mrazek had a very hot start to his season, though he has cooled off of late. With a .904 save percentage and a .04 goal saved above expected, Mrazek has been up to task for the Blackhawks this year. He hasn't stolen them many games, but to be honest, if Chicago was counting on that, they were sorely mistaken. He did just sign a contract extension that'll pay him $4.25 million for the next 2 years, but in all honesty, that's not the worst contract in the world for a goalie. Hell, it wouldn't even make him one of the 20 highest paid goaltenders in the NHL this year. Mrazek has played to his level. You can't really ask much more than that, and you certainly can't lay a ton of the Blackhawks' defensive woes on him when they give up over 30 shots against a game.
Oh, no. No. Ow.
Yeah, Chicago's injury luck has been quite terrible this year. According to NHL Injury Viz, the 2023-24 Blackhawks lost the second highest cap hit of injured players over the course of the year. Now, a lot of that has to do with them losing their big acquisition in the offseason, Taylor Hall, to injury basically before the year even started. They also lost Connor Bedard for quite a while, Andreas Athanasiou was out for a bit, and Seth Jones had his own stint on the injury reserve. All told, it was a pretty brutal year for the Blackhawks when it comes to injuries, but I don't think that any of these injuries were what kept them from making the playoffs.
You think you're so damn special? I don't think I'm special. My mother always said I'm not special.
Honestly, when it comes to special teams, the Blackhawks were pretty decent. They were 21st in PK percentage and 8th best in times shorthanded per game. Their power play was bad at only 16%, but it's not exactly surprising given the lack of offensive talent they had on their team this year. They were one of the lowest scoring teams generally, so it's no surprise that they had a terrible power play. I really don't think you could put the Blackhawks failing this year on their special teams.
Hell, I'm in. High five, dude.
At 5-on-5, though, the Blackhawks were brutal. They had the worst expected goals for at 5-on-5 for any team in the NHL, with only 1.74 expected goals for at 5-on-5 per game. By contrast, each game they were expected to allow 2.3 goals against at 5-on-5, which was the 4th worst mark in the NHL. No surprise, the Chicago Blackhawks were a bad team that played bad most of the time. They had basically nobody who could score whose name wasn't Connor Bedard, and on defense it was Seth Jones and Kevin Korchinski trying valiantly to carry the likes of Jared Tenorti and Jacob Megna. The hope in Chicago has to be that with an off-season of training, those young guys can develop into halfway decent players.
Don't make me fire you.
You can't fire me. You're acting manager, not office manager, so you have no firing powers.
Kyle Davidson has been in charge of the Blackhawks since 2021, and since then it has been a massive teardown. After 4 years, you'd be hoping that some of the seeds would finally begin to bloom, but so far it's only looked like Bedard and Korchinski have been the young players that have looked like foundational pieces for the Blackhawks. They do have young guys in college ranks like Oliver Moore, who put up 33 points and 9 goals with Minnesota and was named to the Big Ten All-Freshman team this year. Frank Nazar out of Michigan had 36 goals and 14 points as a sophomore, while players like Lucas Reichel and Wyatt Kaiser started to get bigger roles on the Blackhawks this year. And the offseason moves that Davidson made this year were good in theory. He added a player like Taylor Hall to help mentor Connor Bedard. He added some veteran players like Nick Foligno and Corey Perry. The problem is they've just all blown up in his face massively. I don't think that they should fire Kyle Davidson, but I do think it's time to start really taking a deep look at his roster building skills.
This guy sucks.
Well, yeah. I had the Blackhawks ranked as the worst team in the NHL coming into this season, and they were only briefly outside of the basement of the NHL because the San Jose Sharks forgot how to win for a month. The Blackhawks are a team that simply had no talent coming into this year, so for them to be the first NHL team eliminated from playoff contention isn't really a surprise, or at least it shouldn't be to Blackhawks fans. This isn't a matter of a team like the Penguins or the Devils who had high expectations and just belly flopped. The Blackhawks are who I thought they would be, a very bad young team whose hope is in the future. The good news is that they do have a bright future with all of their prospects and Connor Bedard as a stud that they are going to be able to build around. The big questions in my mind are behind the bench and in the executive box. Hopefully, those two questions will be answered by the end of next season, when the Blackhawks' window for competitiveness should really be starting to open up. Of course, all these break feelings are going to be gone if they manage to slip on up in the NPL, fall into Macklin Celebrini, and accidentally create another dynasty. God, I would hate to be rooting for the team in the Central.
Bedard now. Main Street. He scores!